Hey everybody, so today I'm going to cover a little bit about LR Timelapse, how to use it, and the benefits of it. It's a very powerful program that works in conjunction with Lightroom to create a very seamless time lapse that and reduces the flicker that you see in a lot of these. Simplifies the process. Anyway, I'm going to start off by going to Google, and you just type in LR Timelapse. Immediately what should come up, type 1 should be lrtimelapse.com. Just click on that. It will take you to the front page. Click on download, and then you'll have a choice to either download the Windows or the Mac version. So download that, unzip it, install it on your computer, and then you'll be able to open it. Once you open it, this is the screen you'll get. Now I have the upgraded version. This is the paid version. Anything under 400 frames you can do with the free version. So I suggest downloading the free version first. Use that for a while. Make sure that this is something you do want to purchase. If you want to do any commercial use, or if you want more than 400 frames, you will have to upgrade though. So prior to opening this and downloading it, what I've done is I have taken a time-lapse sequence and put it in a single file. I don't want it with anything else, and I put it on my desktop, and this is what it is right here. 4/9/2022. It's a sunset time-lapse that I took not too long ago. So what I'll do is in LR Timelapse, if this is not selected on wherever file you want. Now in this case I want the desktop, so inside desktop I can go down here, and again 4/9/2022 sunset time-lapse. This is the one I've designated that I want to show you. So here it loads all the files that are all the images that are in that file, and it gives you the basic settings, what the luminosity is, the aperture, shutter speed, ISO, etc. Also the size of the image and the name. And as it loads these, what it'll do is along here it'll kind of show the luminosity level of each image, and you can see there's a lot of little up and down movement in this line. So we're going to eventually get to that and smooth that out. That would be flicker in the picture. But first, our first step here, now that we have these in here, is to create keyframes. And so if you just click on the keyframe wizard, this will give you an option to select keyframes. Now if you use this little slider here, you can select 3, 4, 5 keyframes, however many you want. Now in this particular case, I'm going to select individual keyframes exactly where I want them. By using this slider, it evenly spaces them throughout. So if by selecting 3, I will have 1 keyframe at the beginning, 1 right in the middle, and 1 at the end. On this particular time lapse, I do not want that, so I'm going to drop this down to just 1. It always leaves the first image as a keyframe. That's that little diamond, and when you select it, it'll turn blue. So that is going to be a designated keyframe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this across, and as the light changes, so right about in there, I'm going to want another keyframe, and it highlights that little area right where this is. So I'm going to add a keyframe at image 179, and then I'm going to go across, and I see some more pretty good changes right in there. So I'm going to add another keyframe at picture number 318, and I'm going to continue on. Sky kind of darkens even a little bit more, not too much, but right around in there. So we'll add another one at picture number 497, and not a lot happening after that, just until the end, and another keyframe on the last picture. So I now have my keyframe selected, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Somewhat evenly spaced, but not quite. I've picked exactly where I want them. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click the Save button. And this is going to save that designation as a keyframe to the metadata in those files, just the 5 of them. And so what I want to do now is go over to Lightroom. I'm going to open that up, and inside Lightroom I need to be in Library. So I'm going to click on Library here once it opens. I will click on Library, and I'm just going to shrink the size of this page just to show you what I'm doing, because I'm going to grab this right here, the drag to Lightroom, and I'm going to drag that over to Lightroom, and I'm going to drop it in the middle of all these pictures here, and that's going to import that sequence of pictures into Lightroom. And okay, now that I've imported these files into Lightroom, I can now go in and say, alright, right down here there's a little drop down menu. It says filters off, and what I want to do is I want to click on that drop down menu, and I want to click on 01 LRT keyframes, and this is going to select just those pictures that we pick to be keyframes in the sequence. So there'll be 5 of them, and so we got 5 pictures here, and it stars those. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to go in, we're going to develop these. So I'm just going to do kind of just like I would in any picture. I'm going to make some edits using the sliders. Okay, so I've made a few edits here. Yeah, I changed the profile to Adobe Landscape, adjusted the white balance, up the exposure, dropped a little highlights, add some shadows, a little bit of whites, tiny bit of texture, touch of vibrance, but dropped the saturation, added a small bit of curves adjustment, and then I sharpened it up and masked out some of the sharpness. Always, if you're going to do any kind of sharpening, always use the mask slider. If you hold down the Alt button, I think that's Command on Apple, if you slide that across, you don't want to sharpen the whole picture because all you're doing is introducing noise, but this will allow you to determine exactly what is sharpened. So just the white areas get sharpened, so I'm going to put it right about there at 71, and obviously remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. And so this is what I end up with. And then I will select all, by holding down the Shift key, I will select all 5 pictures, and I'm just going to sync all my settings across those. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to click off to the side, or hit Control D to deselect, and I might make some adjustments to each individual one of these. I just want to start with a base. Now to me this one's a little bit bright, so I'm going to drop down, and as a sunset happens things tend to get darker, so just kind of going with the logical progression of things here. And then on this one I'll also make it darker, and next one also a little bit darker. I'm going to bring up the white balance just a touch because things tend to change a little bit during that time. And then finally the last one, I want this one to be even darker. Kind of like it's end of the day, finishing everything off. So there should be some pretty good adjustments going through. And so now we have all the settings, and so what we're going to do is we're going to move this back to LR Timelapse, and all these differences in settings, be it exposure, white balance, saturation, whatever, will get, they call it ramping, where it goes from one image, one keyframe to the next, and makes minor adjustments to each picture in between. So these are all done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select them all, just hit Control A, and I'm going to come up to Library, and I want to go to Metadata, and I want to save metadata to file. So I made all these changes. I need to tell the files that those changes have been made so that LR Timelapse can now read those changes. That's done. So I'm going to go back over to LR Timelapse. It's already reading these changes here. I can say reload, and it'll read the metadata off those files, And once it does that, then we will do an auto transition, and that will be the ramping part where it goes from one picture to the next. So I will hit auto transition, and it is doing the transitions in between each one of these. So every file in this time lapse, every picture will get some at least minor adjustments in between the keyframes. Okay, so the visual preview's just finished, and now you can click the little play button. It'll run through, and if you'll notice right away that there is substantial flicker, very common in time lapses. If I go back and click here, you can see the little pink line going across, and it's up and down all over the place. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the next step, which is visual deflicker. I'm just going to click on that, and it'll place a green line behind that pink line that will kind of show the smoothing of that. Almost always right around 10 to sometimes maybe even up to 20, but right around 10 to 12 usually ends up being about right. And just hit apply, and that will go through and deflicker this time lapse. After that, it's going on to export and render. So this can take a little while, so I'm gonna go get something to eat. Okay, now the visual flicker has finished. So now we have two options. We can export and render in Lightroom, which means I would go back to Lightroom, import the metadata, and then export it from there, and then come back to LR Timelapse to do the final rendering. That is a little bit better quality to do that way. A much simpler way is to just go to export and render internal. So all the rest of it just happens inside LR Timelapse. So I just click on that. I decide where I'm going to put this final video. So right now I'm just going to throw it on the desktop. Just makes it a little easier to find. I'll just hit OK. Now it brings up a page where I can select the name, the output file, any kind of extra blur. Most of these things, so let me come right over here to the preset name. I'm just going to leave it for right now. I can always change that later. Codec, I'm almost always the MP4. Output size, so if I want a smaller size of a 720 1080, or if I want to keep it at 4K, it's totally up to you. Quality, I'm going to keep it at high. Frame rate 29.97. If you want to change that, you can, but typically the defaults are best. Finally, the forced aspect ratio. Now this one you may want to change. This one allows you to change it to like a 16:9 or keep the current ratio the way it is. I can add additional blur. Typically a little bit of motion blur is good. Sharpen, if I want a copyright overlay, I can add that. I don't want that in the time lapse. And then finally at the very end I can show it in Explorer, and I always check delete intermediary sequence after rendering. I don't want any. Okay, so now I'm just going to click on export and render, and this will take a little while to finish off the final video, but I'm looking forward to seeing how it looks at the end. And once you click on export and render, right down here on the bottom left will be a bar that keeps track of its progress. This is pretty slow. This is usually about the time I go to bed and wake up the next morning to see the final product. Okay, so once this thing finally finishes rendering, which will take quite some time, it'll pop up a little window and right where the video is, and then you can play it. And should look something like that. Should be very smooth. You notice there's no flickering going on or anything like that. Now from here you can take this video into Adobe Premiere or After Effects or any kind of video editing program to add either music or anything like that. That is beyond the capabilities of LR Timelapse, but as you can see, it does a fantastic job of creating the actual time lapse.